It was a clear and sunny day, with the sun's rays streaming through the high windows of the aristocrat's mansion. The whole house was permeated with light, giving it an atmosphere of lightness and grace. The young maid, dressed in a neat black dress and white apron, looked tiredly but with satisfaction at the results of her work. Suddenly, another maid, whose name was Megan, entered the room. Megan admired the results of his colleague's work. The living room, sparkling with cleanliness and comfort, looks as if it had been prepared for the reception of the most distinguished guests. The furniture was arranged with special grace, freshly washed glass shines on the windows, and the floor, covered with shiny parquet, seems like a mirror in which the sun's rays are reflected. Suddenly, Sandy's gaze was drawn to something on the wall. The young maid stood in front of the painting hanging on the wall and looked at it with undisguised admiration and delight. The painting showed a young aristocrat with fiery red short hair and brown eyes, and the smile on his lips made him even more attractive. For Sandy, her infatuation with the young master was quite appropriate, because while other maids who liked opera singers spent money on attending their concerts, the girl could admire the owner living in this mansion whenever she wanted. The maid could not tear herself away from this picture. Her gaze slid along every curve of his face, studying every feature. Megan tried to warn her friend because she could never become part of this world. Moreover, everyone was well aware that the gentleman behind this beautiful shell was rude and changed girls like gloves, and nevertheless, Sandy continued to consider him not a bad person. At the same time, Megan, on the contrary, did not have the best opinion of the gentleman. Even so, she respected his privacy and continued to perform her duties diligently. As they continued cleaning, the maids discussed the young master's meticulous attitude towards cleanliness and order. While Megan thought he was misophobic, Sandy thought the owner was just very neat. After all, as a child, Sandy witnessed how people suffering from misophobia behave. She grew up with just such a person. Every day, coming home, the little girl saw how her exhausted mother, despite her poor health and fatigue, continued to clean. The woman ended up dying of a heart attack after scrubbing the floors all day, trying to get rid of the dust. Remembering all this, the girl prayed for only one thing, so that her mother's soul could at least now find peace. Suddenly, Megan noticed that the gentleman had been nowhere to be seen since the morning. Having learned that the man did not spend the night at home, the girl was extremely surprised, not understanding how she could date other girls with a famous beauty as her bride. Suddenly, the angry voice of the Duke was heard, who was dissatisfied with Killian's behavior. The elderly man furiously entered the mansion looking for his grandson. But looking around, I couldn't find him. Then the Duke turned to his assistant with a question about where Killian was. Noticing that the guy was at a loss to answer, Megan took the initiative to say that the young master had left last night and had not returned yet. Hearing this, the angry Duke reminded Helly that he had already been warned last month about what would happen if Killian was late for his meeting with the Clement family again. The angry aristocrat ordered that this impudent man be immediately found and brought to Alexandra Clement. Seeing this state of the gentleman, the workers turned pale with fear. The Duke turned away and left. Helly immediately began to hastily choose clothes for the young master. Having chosen all the necessary things, the guy called Sandy with him, since she remembered where the house of the ballerina with whom the young owner was seeing was located. Without waiting for the girl's answer, he grabbed her hand and dragged her along in search of Killian, because if the young master kept the Clement's daughter waiting this time, they would lose their jobs in an instant. At this time, the young aristocrat was having fun with his next mistress. The young girl was not against the specific preferences of her young lover. She even made fun of him, asking if the senators knew what kind of person he was. Opening the curtains, the guy replied with a grin that they were unlikely to know, because he had never tied any member of parliament to his bed. The rays of the sun immediately penetrated the room, blinding the lady's eyes. They made her squint in irritation. The guy justified his actions by saying that the girl should see everything in bright light. The young girl was attracted by her lover's audacity and self-confidence. Killian slowly approached her, making her heart flutter in sweet anticipation. Suddenly, they were interrupted by loud voices outside. The Duke's workers appeared at the most inopportune moment and looked for their young master in a panic. Hearing their voices, Killian was forced to stop because they again found him like some evil spirits. Realizing that Helly would not just leave, the young master allowed him to enter, which extremely embarrassed his mistress, since the girl was in inappropriate appearance. Having received permission, the assistant and the maid immediately rushed into the room. Helly cried and complained to the young master, asking why he was doing this to him. While Hallie helped Killian cover himself, the Sandys hurriedly collected all his things. The young lady, still with her hand tied, lay irritably in bed, waiting for this farce to end. Seeing this, Sandy thought that perhaps she was not comfortable. Then he hesitantly approached and still untied the lady. But the ballerina didn't even thank the girl, because she believed that there was no need for this, since she could handle it herself. Having dressed and shooed the young gentleman, the workers took him out of the house and sent him to the carriage. The carriage swayed slightly as soon as the guy closed the door behind him. Then the coachman, who was waiting for the signal, immediately pulled the reins, and the horses harnessed to the carriage moved off. Following the Duke's orders, Killian was rushed to Clement County. Already in the carriage, the maid asked the young master to change clothes. Realizing that it was useless to resist, Killian reluctantly began to undress. Being so close to the object of her affection, the girl blushed with embarrassment. Admiration and delight were visible in her eyes, because this man was the embodiment of her ideals. He was exactly the way she imagined a real hero. Realizing that she had been looking at him for too long, the maid hastily looked away so as not to reveal her feelings. After finishing changing, the young master thanked Sandy with a slight smile. Hearing her name from the lips of her ideal, the girl's heart began to beat faster, and her breathing quickened. People respected the previous Count Clement for his strong character and sound mind. The current count knew that, although his father lost his wife early, he never became the hero of scandalous rumors. But this was exactly until the moment when he, at the age of 50, married a second time to a woman who was not yet 30. But the woman left the world early, leaving behind a child. She was the greatest beauty of the kingdom of Alistair, Alexandra Clement. The girl once again burst into her brother's office with complaints against her fiancé and with a statement that she did not want to marry him. But the Count did not pay any attention to his sister's words, because during their engagement, the girl addressed him with this remark for the 11th time. Alexandra felt resentment and powerlessness, because her opinion was not taken into account when concluding the engagement. Realizing that her brother was turning a deaf ear to all her protests, the offended girl turned around and left. The Count believed that the father spoiled his daughter too much. After some time, the Duke's carriage arrived at the Count's estate. Upon arrival, Helly handed the young master a bouquet of flowers that had been prepared in advance. He explained to the young owner that the flowers were prepared as a gift for Alexandra Clement. Taking the bouquet, Killian left the carriage. Seeing him, Alexandra noted with semi-sarcasm that this time the guy showed up on time. Lord Winfrid answered her in the same manner, expressing his joy that the girl was standing on 2 legs today. The tension between them was so strong that you could feel it on your skin, like thick jelly. Noticing the flowers, the girl immediately made it clear that she was not going to accept such a tasteless bouquet. But upon hearing her words, the guy immediately handed her a bouquet with the words that it suits her very well. Alexandra was extremely annoyed by the Lord's impudence and tactlessness. She accepted the gift with displeasure, saying that the rumors that the Lord had delicious taste were not true, because these flowers looked as if they had been cut from a nearby field. Having said this, Alexandra suddenly noticed the maid, who had been standing next to Killian all the time and looking at her with surprise and incomprehension. The lady approached Sandy and threw her a bouquet of flowers and told her to keep it for herself. Then she turned around and left. The maid was dumbfounded. She stood in a stupor, not knowing what to do. But Killian ignored Alexandra's action and silently followed her. Understanding the girl's bewilderment, Helly apologized to her and sent her back to the estate. Having said this, he handed her money for the journey and ran after the young master. For some time, the girl looked after them, not understanding why the Lord did not like his bride, the first beauty of the kingdom. But then she turned around and went back, continuing to look at the bouquet she received along the way, and not understanding why the lady called them tasteless. What she was most upset about was that these were the flowers she had chosen with all her heart. To console herself, Sandy decided to perceive the bouquet as a gift from her master, because it also touched him. Rejoicing at the bouquet she received, the girl headed back to the mansion. She felt happy and grateful for the gentleman's attention. Her heart was pounding, she was excited about the day, and it seemed that this excitement would keep her awake all night. At this time, Alexandra and Killian enjoyed tea together in complete silence. A young girl interrupted the silence, making a witty remark, saying that it was unusual to see people staggering around the beds of frivolous women. The guy responded no less wittily, noting that it was this road that led him to her. The lady did not appreciate the joke, considering it too vulgar, while the lord insisted that it was not a joke at all. Then Alexandra became furious, suggesting that Killian came to her straight from the bed of a similar person, but the guy did not even think of denying anything. On the contrary, he complimented her theory, saying that in order to come to meet her, he had to leave that person for a while tied to the bed. The young lady was simply dumbfounded by such details of her fiancé's personal life, and knowing that he was going to become prime minister, she was extremely concerned about the future of her country. Suddenly, the guy pointed to his head. The girl watched his hand carefully, trying to understand what he was going to say. Then the guy released his finger, pointing to his crotch. The girl continued to follow the guy's finger with her eyes. Then, looking her straight in the eyes, the guy said with a slight grin that these were two completely different things. Hearing these words, the young and pure aristocrat was speechless with embarrassment. She immediately called the servants in a panic. Continuing to enjoy his tea, Killian calmly watched the next performance that his bride put on. After listening to her mistress, the maid cast an ambiguous glance towards her colleague, after which Alexandra lost consciousness, and 3 maids tried to revive her. For the guy, such a scene was not new, so he wasn't even worried. Trying to hide his irritation, Killian smiled, regretting that he had not managed to escape to the neighboring kingdom, breaking all ties with his grandfather before the conclusion of this engagement. The girl was angry and extremely dissatisfied with the expression on his face. Hearing another barrage of accusations against him and the standard phrase about breaking off the engagement, Killian stood up from his seat and replied that if he had his way, he would have broken off this engagement long ago. Having said this, he slowly approached Alexandra, which made her seriously afraid. Coming closer to her and leaning against her ear, he quietly whispered to her that before marriage she should become a calmer lady, adding that otherwise the naked bride would be gagged in her mouth on her wedding night. Having said this, he smiled and left. The maid was slightly puzzled, not understanding what happened and why the lady was so angry, while the gentleman behaved quite decently. To the point of tears, the irritated bride was sure that her groom was crazy. She was even ready to die rather than become the wife of such a man. It was a bright, sunny day, and a steam locomotive was rushing along the railway route, releasing clouds of smoke and steam. Sandy sat in one of the booths with a bouquet of flowers and looked out the window at the landscapes passing by. 3 hours by train from Riverton, and now she is already in the small town of Carlton, where her mother's grave is located. Seeing a familiar face, the girl greeted joyfully. It was her father, who had been eagerly awaiting the arrival of his only daughter since the morning. Seeing his child after a long separation, the man felt great joy and relief. In her hometown, Sandy was considered strange. One day, she decided to ask her father why other people thought she was strange. Then the man answered without a drop of doubt that she was not strange at all, but special and unique. Hearing this answer, the little girl was immensely happy. Thanks to these words, Sandy found her way in life, and at the age of 15, instead of a proper wedding, she decided to go to Riverton and become a maid. On the way home, the girl told her father that she had seen Alexandra Clement. When the man asked what she was like, the girl answered with admiration that, as rumors say, she was very beautiful, so much so that she was even ashamed to have the same name. Born on the same day, the youngest daughter of Count Clement, the owner of the quarry, and the daughter of Matthew Willey, who worked in this quarry, were named by the same name. Having heard the name of the Count's daughter, Sandy's mother insisted on naming her and Matthew's daughter the same, believing that perhaps with a similar name, their daughter would live a little more nobly. In the end, she was named Alexandra, but this only caused ridicule, and at some point the Laz girl began to be called Sandy. But for Matthew, no matter how beautiful Miss Alexandra was, the best was always his Alexandra Willie. Although Sendy understood that this was only her father's opinion, she was pleased to know that, at least for one person in this world, she would always come first. On the way back from his mother's grave, Matthew again raised the topic of Sendy's marriage, but the girl only laughed it off. Saying goodbye to her father, she shared her plans to become the chief maid at the Chambéry mansion. Matthew was worried that by then his daughter might be past marriageable age, while Sendy was not particularly worried about this. And yet, for the man, as for any loving parent, the most important thing was the happiness and health of his daughter. He was worried that Sendy might repeat the same fate as her mother. Understanding her father's anxiety, the girl gently took his hands and, looking straight into his eyes, made a promise that she would live healthy and happy for a long, long time. Having said goodbye to her father, the girl climbed into the train carriage and, wishing him health, waved her hand. Her father smiled back at her and also waved. Another bright and sunny morning arrived. The sky was blue and clear without a single cloud. The young aristocrat woke up early in the morning and began to get dressed. He was very elegant and stylish, and always took care of his appearance and tried to look impeccable. While Killian was getting himself in order, an assistant standing nearby was simultaneously talking about his plans for the day. At this time, the Duke was looking at work documents in his office. According to the schedule, Killian and the Duke were supposed to attend a joint meeting and then have lunch with members of the house at Lord Grenville's estate. So before leaving, the Lord warned his grandfather that he would go ahead. Seeing his grandson at the door of his office, the Duke asked if he was going to vote against him today, to which the guy jokingly replied that although he was his grandson at home, they were opponents in politics. The Duke did not understand why Killian was so stubborn, and for what reason, breaking family tradition, he insisted on reforms. At the same time, the Lord had repeatedly told his grandfather that he believed that the ideology of the Conservative Party, which feeds on small children, was too pathetic. In his heart, the Duke agreed with his grandson. Banning low-paid work for children under 13, establishing public schools and compulsory basic education for all children was a bill that passed by one vote because Killian, as a political opponent of the Duke, voted in favor. Having finished the conversation, the guy said goodbye to his grandfather and left. Despite the stern words, the Duke was sincerely proud of his grandson and approved of his political views. He watched his actions with anticipation, waiting to see if Killian Winfried could change history. If so, then Duke Winfried should take one of the seats in the Senate. At the same time, in the Clement mansion, Alexandra was hysterical from the very morning, refusing to go anywhere. The Count was already extremely tired of this behavior of his younger sister. The girl came up with various excuses and reasons to refuse the official dinner at the Winfried estate. However, her words had no effect, because the father who indulged her was no longer there. The Count once again explained in detail to Alexandra why she should pacify her temper and accept her engagement to Killian Winfried. Having finished his conversation with his sister, he ordered the servants to dress her more beautiful than ever. The Count believed that beauty was all Alexandra had, so he advised her to take advantage of her appearance. Dark clouds were slowly gathering on the horizon, covering the sun, tension hung in the air, and it became stuffy. Suddenly, the silence was interrupted by a dull rumble of thunder, as if warning of an approaching storm, and the first drops of rain began to fall to the ground, leaving wet traces behind them. Once in her room, the young lady began to cry bitterly. She screamed and was indignant, saying that she hated it all, although she understood that the decision had already been made and she was powerless to change it. The maid tried to calm down her mistress by talking about Killian in a good way, because a lot of ladies were ready to give everything just to talk to him at least once. But knowing him personally, Alexandra was outraged by his behavior and considered Killian Winfried to be low grade. However, the maid did not understand the reason for the young girl's deep hatred of her fiancé. Then Alexandra spoke about Killian's words during the last tea party. Hearing this, the maid was surprised. She thought that the guy had unusual tastes, while at the same time, Alexandra considered him terrible and disgusting. Remembering her father's love and care, Alexandra always dreamed of a man who would love her the same way. Hearing the mistress's words that otherwise she would prefer death, the maid became worried. The young lady felt terrible. At the same time, it was raining heavily outside. A thunderstorm was raging in the forest. A strong wind was bending the trees, and lightning was flashing in the sky. And even in such weather, the maids were obliged to collect the master's favorite mushrooms for the official dinner. Being a fan of the young master, Sandy was very happy to collect his favorite mushrooms. Suddenly, one of the girls remembered that Sandy was supposed to have the day off. Seeing her colleagues' surprise that she was working in such weather, even though she was supposed to be resting, Sandy explained that she switched with Megan, since she was going out in her place on the anniversary of her mother's death. Suddenly, one of the dogs began to act restless. She did not obey, which caused a lot of problems for the maid who was holding the leash. Then Sandy offered her help to her colleague. As the rain intensified, making further mushroom picking impossible, the other servant suggested that they fold up. Realizing that there was no point in continuing in such weather, Sandy decided to also return with the others. But suddenly the dog smelled something and suddenly ran somewhere. Sandy immediately rushed after her to catch her. Suddenly the dog stopped and started digging. Taking advantage of the fact that the dog was busy, Sandy slowly walked over to grab the leash. At that same second, strong lightning struck the tree under which they were standing. Then a loud crash rang through the forest, and a bright light blinded them for a moment. The girl jumped back in fright. The dog galloped away. Having stumbled, the girl twisted her ankle and fell off the cliff. The thunderclaps were deafening. Pale with fear, Alexandra was in the carriage at that moment, halfway to the place of the official dinner. The carriage, wet and weather-beaten, drove slowly along the washed-out and bumpy roads. The maid tried to calm the frightened mistress. To help her relax a little, the maid gave her a hand massage. Suddenly, the carriage shook violently and stopped. Lightning struck the carriage with incredible force, accompanied by deafening thunder. Sandy had a dream where she became a mushroom and jumped around her beloved master. She slowly opened her eyes and saw an unfamiliar room in front of her. The young maid was delighted to see that her mistress had come to her senses. The unfamiliar maids addressed Sandy respectfully and said that she had been unconscious for 5 days, but the girl did not understand who they were and where she was. Noticing her long black hair, the girl was dumbfounded. Noticing the expression on her face, the concerned maids asked if she was okay. Sitting up on the bed, she saw a noble lady in the mirror. Looking at her reflection, Sandy could not believe her eyes because it was not her, but Alexandra Clement. At this time, sitting in his room, Killian noticed that something had changed. Getting up from his seat, he decided to look around to understand what was going on. Unexpectedly, he turned to the maid, who was cleaning at that moment, which greatly frightened her. He asked the girl what happened to the mantelpiece. The maid, pale with fear, replied that the shelf was a little dirty. Then Killian continued to point out other poorly cleaned parts of the room. He also noted that some things are out of place. Having ordered everything to be corrected, Killian left the room. Seeing the young master, one of the servants ran up to him. He excitedly conveyed the Duke's order that Killian visit Alexandra Clement and inquire about her health. Expecting a refusal, the servant was ready to start persuading him, but surprisingly, he agreed to go there in half an hour. The guy was extremely surprised by the young master's humility. Suddenly, Killian asked him about the incident with Sandy. The servant, although he believed that this was a sad incident, but without a drop of compassion, thought that this incident should be hushed up, since Sandy was just a maid. Hearing these words, Killian suddenly stopped and turned to face him. With a stern voice, he asked the servant who he was. Hearing Henry's answer, Killian added with a grin that it was primarily about politics. And as a politician with the last name Winfred, he needed to take responsibility for this accident that occurred on their family estate. Hearing the words of his master, Henry obediently accepted his will. Realizing that she was in someone else's body, Sandy first tried to tell everything honestly. But as expected, her words that she was she, but not her, sounded like the ravings of a madman. Therefore, both the Count and the maids, seeing her in such a state, thought that she had hit her head during the accident. Sandy tried with all her might to prove the veracity of her words and her sanity. She insisted that if she was returned to Chambéry, she would be able to find out everything by meeting her real self. Even for a person who had directly experienced this, it was difficult to believe it, let alone outsiders. So, naturally, the Count, not believing a single word she said, assumed that this was Alexandra's next plan to break off the engagement. Sandy, being a commoner, did not know how to properly enter into a conversation with an aristocrat because all she could do was apologize and try again and again to explain the situation. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a maid who said that a message had arrived from the Chambéry castle. Upon hearing the news that Killian Winfrid was heading towards them to visit his bride, the Earl stood up from his seat, stunned. The Count clearly did not expect such a turn of events, because it was obvious that Killian had only to see Alexandra in such a state, and he would immediately demand that the engagement be terminated. While he was thinking in a panic how to avoid this, the girl continued to insist that she was not Alexandra and asked to return her home. Then, unable to withstand the tension, the Count lost his temper and raised his voice to his sister, thereby scaring her to death. The man did not understand what was happening to her. Although the young lady was capricious and headstrong, she never behaved like crazy. The Count even suggested that his sister could really be possessed by the ghost of the maid who died that day. Hearing this, Sandy's heart froze with fear. She felt a cold run through her body and her palms began to sweat. With a trembling voice, the girl asked who the dead maid was. Seeing that her nervousness had returned and the girl was in a semi-fainting state, the Count sarcastically told her that this was the best proof that she was the real Alexandra Clement. But Sandy ignored everything. The only thing that stuck in her head was the phrase about the dead maid. So jumping up from her seat, she repeated once again that she was that maid, and therefore could not die. However, the Count did not believe her, and, in order to prevent the crazy sister from meeting the Lord, he ordered that she be given sleeping pills, and Killian was told that she had not yet recovered. The girl continued to shout after the departing Count, but no one listened to her, much less believed her. One of the maids, in order to calm the mistress, said that it was time to take the medicine. Hearing this, the girl pushed the servant away and ran away, because she understood that if she took sleeping pills, she would fall asleep again for several days. She ran from the maids as fast as she could, without looking back. Their screams pursued her, but she did not stop. She was scared, her heart was pounding, and her breathing was labored, and all she could think about was telling Killian that Sandy Willie was not dead. And so, his carriage slowly approached the Clement estate. The servant in the carriage heard a noise outside. He looked out the window and saw the commotion that Alexandra had caused. Confused, the servant immediately called his master to look out the window too. A barefoot young lady ran towards the carriage with several maids chasing after her. Seeing his proud and arrogant bride like this, Killian was speechless in surprise. But the Lord was even more shocked when the girl ran past the carriage and headed towards the exit. However, she never made it to the gate, because, having tripped, Alexandra fell face down. Although such a situation would be humiliating for a true lady, it was not for Sandy, so the girl, without paying any attention to those around her, stood up again and continued on her way. Having known the girl for so many years, the Lord and his servant were shocked by her action. An arrogant and proud lady who always looked down on everyone ran away barefoot and in a soiled dress from her maids. Seeing this, Killian ran after her. He quickly caught up with her and, grabbing her hand, stopped her. Turning around, the girl looked at the Lord. Fear was visible in her eyes. Suddenly, her strength left her and Alexandra lost consciousness right in the arms of her fiancé. Waking up in bed, Sandy realized that this aristocrat was fragile, like a porcelain doll. After some time, the maid entered the room, who was glad to see that the lady was already awake. Sandy was confused. Being in Alexandra's body, she did not know what or how to say. In order not to be mistaken for a madman again, Sandy decided to behave like Alexandra Clement. However, she still didn't know how to interact with the maids since she had been one of them until now. So Sandy decided to act as arrogant as possible, her irritated voice echoing throughout the room. With her arms crossed over her chest, turning to her maid, she declared that everything around her was irritating her, and she could not stand it any longer. Seeing this behavior of the young lady, the maid became happy, thinking that her mistress had returned to normal again. Since the servant believed in Alexandra's adequacy, Sandy hoped that she would no longer be fed sleeping pills. Suddenly, the maid's suspicious gaze returned again. Sandy turned pale with fright, not knowing where she had made a mistake this time. It turned out that due to severe hunger, she did not even notice that she had started eating a second portion. Although she really wanted to eat, In order not to arouse unnecessary suspicion, Sandy, like a true aristocrat, had to refuse food, saying that she could not eat anymore. Seeing the mistress's usual behavior, the maid was delighted. Sandy had to refuse food, even though she didn't want to. Suddenly, the servant turned to her mistress again. In order not to accidentally give herself away, Sandy thought that the best option would be to faint again. Having made a decision, Alexandra did just that. Seeing that this did not arouse any suspicion, and, on the contrary, helped to win the favor of the maid, Sandy realized that in any unclear situation, you can use this method. After all, it is obvious that the maids are already accustomed to this and are trained in how to care for the mistress at such moments. The Duke was worried during dinner, as he was worried about Alexandra's health. Seeing this, Killian said that everything would be fine because she had no serious injuries. The guy did not want to bother his grandfather even more, so he did not talk about the incident during his visit. Continuing the conversation, the Duke asked Killian about the maid who died that day, to which the Lord replied that, having accepted responsibility, he paid compensation to her family. Hearing his grandson's answer, the Duke praised him for his excellent reasoning and wise decision. Killian was glad to hear praise from the Duke himself. At the same time, he sincerely appreciated that maid, since she was responsible for cleaning his room for the longest time, and also withstood his difficult character. Then the Duke and his grandson began to discuss government issues, in particular the recently adopted bill. The Duke did not understand why supporters of reform opposed the budget put forward by the draft, while the Lord believed that there was an extremely large amount of useless spending. Another morning came, and the Count's estate was already noisy from the very morning. The newly minted aristocrat, who had recently been an ordinary maid who worked in the Duke's household, was extremely embarrassed when her maids helped her take a bath. The maids diligently and carefully did their job of caring for their mistress. Having completed the basic procedures, the maids left the room, allowing the young lady to rest. Unaccustomed to such procedures, Sandy felt tired after the massage and bath. Finally left alone, the girl decided not to miss this chance and began to prepare to escape. She put on the simplest thing she found in the arrogant lady's wardrobe, a black dress. Sandy also decided to borrow some money from Alexandra to pay for the trip to her hometown. The girl was honest and not greedy, so she took only 50 crowns. She was determined to return to her old life before it was too late. During the day, the city was lively, and people scurried through the streets minding their own business. Killian and his assistant were sitting in a cafe and waiting for Sir Wensley, who was late. Suddenly, the assistant noticed a girl who looked like Alexandra Clement, but the Lord couldn't stomach the fact that his arrogant and fragile bride could be outside his estate. But the assistant insisted that it was her. Then Killian looked out the window and saw the girl. It was Alexandra, and her exquisite beauty really stood out from the others. She was tall and slender, with long dark hair and bright blue eyes. The lady was alone, without maids, and was obviously in a hurry somewhere, so Killian and his assistant decided to follow the girl. But before they had time to get up, someone called them. It was Sir Wensley, who approached the table and awkwardly apologized for being late. Killian was not happy with the fact that the guy appeared at such a moment, so he said in an irritated tone that if Elliot Wensley was late again, he would not wait any longer. While the men were talking, the girl disappeared into the crowd. For the inhabitants of the small village in front of the Matthew Quarry, Willie has now become a symbol of misfortune. He lost his wife while still young, and now his only daughter has died. The villagers, of course, sympathized with his loss, but many of them believed that it was all his fault, because if he had not allowed Sandy to become a maid, none of this would have happened. On top of that, Matthew continued to miss work, which caused dissatisfaction with his superiors, because there is an end to everything. Then one of the workers said that if he did not return to work, he would be fired. After the death of his beloved daughter, the man lost the will to live. Having reached her house, Sandy saw her emaciated father, barely dragging his feet, walking somewhere. The girl decided to follow Matthew, and saw that he had come to his daughter's grave. On his knees, he cried and begged for forgiveness from his beautiful Alexandra. He blamed himself for the fact that his Sandy had passed away so early. It was very painful for her to see her father in such a state. The girl mentally addressed her father, saying that she was here, she was nearby, and she was still alive. But Sandy did not dare to say these words out loud, because now she was in the body of Alexandra Clement. After some time, the exhausted man, struggling to get up, finally stood up. His legs were trembling, and his face was pale and emaciated. He was very weak and could not maintain his balance, staggering in different directions. However, straining all his strength, he left. After Matthew left, Sandy walked up to her grave, trembling with fear. She couldn't believe that her life had come to an end, and her heart was beating like it was in shock. Realizing the reality, the girl fell to her knees in despair, tears streaming down her cheeks. The girl's feet, trying to cope with the grief of realizing reality, led her back to her home. She stood at the door, again mentally turning to her father and saying that she was alive. Sandy wanted so much that they could be together again, so that she could snuggle into her beloved daddy's chest and feel his warmth and comfort. But she never decided to knock on the door of her home, because this is not her appearance. Sandy understood that her father had already experienced many difficulties and losses in life, and did not want to cause her father more pain and suffering. Sitting in the carriage, Killian was still thinking about the unusual behavior of his bride. Suddenly, he ordered the carriage to stop, which greatly surprised his assistant. Looking into the crowd, he ordered Miss Clement to be brought to him. Since Alexandra did not look like herself, the servant did not immediately notice her. Therefore, the Lord had to point his finger at his bride. The girl was pale, with eyes swollen from tears, disheveled hair, and wearing a black cloak. Having accepted the order, the man approached the aristocrat to call her. Pointing to Killian's carriage, the servant said that the master was waiting for her. Since Killian was Alexandra's fiancé, it would be strange to refuse to continue waiting for the stagecoach, so Sandy had to agree. As soon as the girl got into the carriage, it drove off. Killian was the first to start the conversation by saying that Alexandra seemed very busy today. Confused, the girl answered with the first thing that came to mind, saying that she was visiting a friend. However, because of her confusion, she did not notice how she addressed her fiancé with the word master. Realizing her mistake, she hastened to correct herself and called him Lord Winfred. Seeing Alexandra's disheveled appearance and strange behavior, Killian assumed that she had problems with her head. But given their relationship, he decided not to dwell too much on it and told her that he was going to take her home. Not knowing how to respond in such a situation, Sandy decided to remain silent. And this looked extremely suspicious to Killian, since, given Alexandra's eccentric nature, she always found something to answer. But Sandy justified her behavior by saying that she needed to be a discreet lady. Then Killian decided to play a trick on her again, saying that if she continued to behave so well, it would avoid the tragedy of gagging on her wedding night. Hearing these words, Sandy was speechless with embarrassment. The innocent girl's heart was not ready for such jokes. Red as a tomato, she moved as far as possible from the Lord. Her reaction was very different from the first time, and the most surprising thing was that she didn't even express indignation. After some time, the coachman reported that they had already arrived at the estate of Count Clement. Stopping the carriage, the servant opened the door and helped the lady out. But the extremely embarrassed girl, having forgotten about any manners, ran out of the carriage like a bullet, leaving a final word of gratitude. Killian enjoyed watching Alexandra like this, so he didn't want to let her go so easily. Calling her, he asked if she was going to give him what she had in her hand. The girl was extremely surprised by this question, since in her hands she was holding silver coins with which she was going to pay for the stagecoach. Being a commoner, Sandy did not understand the relationship between aristocrats, so she was confused, taking Killian's words at face value. The girl was not sure how much to pay, so she decided to pay as much as a stagecoach ride would cost. Killian was so stunned by these actions of his fiancée that he did not immediately understand how he accepted the money. Seeing the expression on the Lord's face, Sandy thought that perhaps she had made a mistake with the amount, so she decided to add another coin on top. Killian was just in shock. He didn't know what to think. Sandy mistook her face, distorted with shock, for a smile, and decided that this time the fare was satisfactory and the trip cost 3 crowns. Having paid for the trip, the girl said goodbye to the Lord once again before leaving, and thanking him again, Sandy turned around and left. Realizing that Alexandra's fiancé was watching her, Sandy tried to walk as elegantly as possible. However, instead of the intended graceful doe, her gait was more reminiscent of a fat dove. After she left, Killian continued to stare at the coins in confusion. Another day in someone else's body has ended. Sandy continued to be haunted by hallucinations where Alexandra demanded her body back. Suddenly, the girl clearly heard someone in anger calling her a vile servant who had brazenly occupied her body. It was an angry Alexandra who was extremely outraged by this turn of events. She thought that Sandy had deliberately taken her place and was demanding that she leave her body. She abruptly approached it, trying to force it out of her body. But everything was even, because she did not have a physical form, so she could not even touch her. Seeing Alexandra's hands pass through her, Sandy was also extremely surprised. Confused, she asked the lady why she was transparent. The angry young lady again blamed Sandy for everything, saying that it was all because of her. Then the girl got scared, thinking that Alexandra had become a ghost. But the angry Miss Clement continued to chase her and demand her body back. However, no matter how hard she tried, she still couldn't touch the body. Alexandra then decided that the only way for her to return to her body was for Sandy to leave it first. But not one of the girls knew how to do this. Moreover, Sandy had nowhere to return because her body had died. Alexandra continued to chase Sandy around the room, accusing her of stealing and demanding her body back. Thus, they ran in a circle until one of them collapsed exhausted. Since only Sandy had a physical body, only she felt tired. Alexandra was extremely outraged by the maid's careless attitude towards her body. Her precious body was injured by some commoner. For Alexandra, such treatment of her body was unacceptable. Out of habit, she extended her hand for the maid to massage. Sandy tried to carry out her will, but, as expected, she could not touch her mistress. Alexandra cried from hopelessness, continuing to get angry and threatened that she would not leave the maid alone. Having said these words, she suddenly disappeared, leaving Sandy standing alone. Sandy was in a stupor, did not understand what had happened, and did not know what to do. There was a commotion in the mine from the very morning. One of the workers told the boss that Matthew was stealing marble. Other workers tried to reason with him so that he would stop. But Matthew didn't think that he was stealing something that belonged to him. He decided to quit, and since he worked in the mine for 25 years, he rightly believed that this was his retirement benefit. The boss tried to stop him, but Matthew was not even going to listen. He was sure that the great owner of Nari would not be harmed if he allocated one stone to his worker, who had been hunching over it for so many years for pennies. Having said this, the man walked away, leaving the shocked boss behind. Understanding his grief after the death of his daughter, and deciding that Matthew had lost his mind on this basis, the boss decided that it was better not to mess with him and left everything as it was. The day was especially bright and sunny, as if anticipating a royal ball. While all the young ladies dreamed of attending such an event at least once, one noble girl argued with her brother from the very morning, refusing to go to the ball. But the count believed that since his sister had already recovered, she should be present at the ball. As usual, he did not listen to Alexandra's objections, and ended the conversation with the order to get ready and wait for his fiancée. Then Sandy thought that the only way to avoid this was to faint again. As if reading her thoughts, the Count immediately warned her that neither losing consciousness nor another hysteria would help, since in any case he would simply send her to Killian's carriage. And at the appointed time, in an elegant blue and white dress that seemed to play in the light, a girl sat. Her azure blue eyes emitted tenderness and mystery, as if reflecting the depths of the ocean, and her black hair, neatly collected, gave her special elegance and sophistication. The carriage glided smoothly along the winding road leading to the majestic castle. The lady sitting inside watched the surrounding scenery, trying to keep her gaze from her charming companion, who looked especially gorgeous this evening. But the lady's gaze was so penetrating that the guy could not help but notice its direction. The girl, caught by surprise, panicked and began to deny any suspicion. She claimed that her look was accidental and had no special meaning. But Sandy, standing in the carriage opposite her ideal, could not hide her embarrassment. Her heart beat faster and her cheeks turned red. The attentive lord noticed this and immediately suggested that perhaps his companion felt hot or stuffy in the cramped carriage. Hearing a negative answer, Killian thought that then perhaps the girl was excited because of him. Sandy, sitting in the carriage, hearing these words, felt her heart sank, because the real Alexandra felt only hatred for her fiancé. Seeing the girl's funny reaction, Killian decided to joke with her, and with a smile on his face, he said that since she was his fiancé, she could tremble as much as she wanted. And noticing her confusion, he gently touched her face with a sly smile. To calm her heart at least a little, Sandy decided to close her eyes and imagine something else, something completely unrelated to the master. Having achieved no reaction, the guy removed his hand. This was something new and not typical of his bride, because before Alexandra would have gone crazy and staged another show, so the guy thought that perhaps this was the consequences of that accident. Soon the carriage arrived at the palace. The Master of Ceremonies announced the arrival of Lord Killian Winfred and Lady Alexandra Clement. Unlike Alexandra, this was Sendi's first time in the palace and, moreover, her first time participating in an aristocratic ball. She was trembling all over and was pale as chalk, and when she saw the king and queen, she was completely speechless. Standing in front of the royals, she didn't know how to behave or how to greet them properly. Killian was surprised by this behavior of his bride, because Alexandra was known as the queen of high society. Approaching the place where they were to greet the royal couple, the Lord advised Alexandra to hold her breath. Sitting on their thrones, the king and queen took turns receiving greetings from all the arriving aristocrats. According to etiquette, Killian bowed and greeted the rulers first. But he suddenly noticed that Alexandra would behave strangely. Instead of an elegant curtsy, she bowed deeply, lowering her head almost to the floor. The entire high society was shocked, and only the wise queen accepted her greeting with a gentle smile and thanked her for such deep respect. At the same time, Killian tried to help her raise her head as casually as possible. Grabbing her hand, he quickly led her out of the ballroom. But the lady, suddenly flushed from lack of oxygen, looked him straight in the eyes and asked if she could already breathe. Killian, who could not imagine that the girl would take his advice so literally, replied that she was free to do what she wanted. After these words, the girl exhaled with relief and was finally able to breathe deeply. Suddenly, other aristocrats called her. During the break, they praised her and inquired about her well-being. The Lord also did not go unnoticed. One of the girls expressed her admiration for such a wonderful gentleman. Realizing that he was superfluous in a female company, Lillian decided to leave Alexandra with her friends. But Sendi felt uncomfortable among unfamiliar girls, especially aristocrats, so she stopped the only person she knew, even before she became Alexandra. Forgetting about the relationship between the real Alexandra and her fiancé, Sendi in desperation asked him not to leave and not leave her alone. Killian was dumbfounded by this behavior of the arrogant Alexandra. The other girls were also confused by their friend's strange behavior. Killian, turning on the ideal groom mode, carefully pulled the girl towards him and, apologizing, asked the young aristocrats to give him the place of Alexandra's interlocutor for that day. The Lord's performance was magnificent. The young ladies were immediately imbued with his tenderness and care. Having said goodbye on such a pleasant note, the young couple left. Coming out onto the veranda, the Lord offered his bride a glass of sparkling champagne. The girl gratefully accepted the glass. However, it was only after Sandy took a sip that she realized it was alcohol. Her face twisted at the unpleasant taste, and she immediately spat it out. She was so shocked that she didn't even immediately notice how she dropped her glass. As usual, she immediately knelt down and began to clean the master's shoes. Forgetting about his role as Alexandra, Sendi said with a smile that everything was already clear. However, all this time, Killian watched the actions of the noble lady with bewilderment. And only now Sandy realized what a fatal mistake she had made. She wanted to fall into the ground out of shame. After so many strange things, Killian began to suspect that Alexandra was up to something again. Looking into her eyes, he angrily asked the girl what was on her mind. Sandy turned pale with fright, her mind racing with thoughts about how she could explain the situation and avoid conflict without revealing the truth. Sudden music interrupted their dialogue. Suddenly, Killian extended his hand to the girl and called her somewhere. Realizing that he was asking her to dance, Sendi became worried. She began to object in confusion, saying that she could not do this under any circumstances. At that moment, Sandy remembered her father's words that if a man came along that she liked, she should under no circumstances dance with him before the wedding. But Killian did not listen to her. His patience was running out. Reaching the center of the ballroom, the Lord gently took Sandy's hand with his left hand and grabbed her waist with his right. Looking at the girl with a stern look, Killian convincingly asked her to behave as before and not make new performances. In secular circles, Alexandra was called the Blue Butterfly because on the day of her debut, instead of a white dress, she wore a blue one and was beautiful, like a sophisticated butterfly. From that day on, she played this role unwaveringly, at least until today's dance. Sandy danced very clumsily and constantly stepped on the Lord's feet. Given her previous gracefulness, Killian thought she was doing this on purpose, but Sandy, not wanting to disgrace her partner, kept apologizing. All the aristocrats were completely shocked by what was happening. Killian was irritated, considering this another prank of his spoiled bride. But Sandy really tried. Her hands were even shaking with excitement. Looking at her condition, the Lord understood that she was most likely not lying. In order not to completely turn into a laughingstock, Killian suggested stopping the dance. But according to etiquette, the dance had to be finished, so leaving the ballroom just like that was unacceptable. Then Killian suggested that Alexandra use her favorite way to solve all problems. However, Sandy did not consider it appropriate to faint right in the palace, as this would be inappropriate behavior. But on the other hand, the real Alexandra did not pay attention to time and place. Besides, losing consciousness is better than such a dance. Realizing that he would still have to come up with some kind of excuse for high society, Killian offered to justify the fainting by the fact that the girl had not yet recovered from what happened. Having agreed on all the details, the young couple came to a common decision: to implement their plan as soon as possible. Taking advantage of the opportune moment, Sandy decided to play the part of losing consciousness and fell into Killian's arms. The Lord played his role superbly, showing visible concern and carefully picking up his bride in his arms. Under the attentive gaze of the aristocrats, Killian elegantly walked towards the exit, carrying Alexandra in his arms. The aristocrats looked after them in bewilderment. After this incident, the guests realized that the girl's strange behavior was caused by poor health. Thus, the aristocrats, having connected the recent accident with the girl's current fainting, themselves came to the conclusion that despite her healthy appearance, she still had not fully recovered. After leaving the ballroom, the young couple immediately boarded the carriage. Once alone, Killian quietly whispered to her that she could open her eyes. Killian, admiring Alexandra's sweet behavior, did not miss the opportunity to make fun of her, and with a smile compared her to a blue caterpillar. However, Sandy did not catch the meaning of the joke and did not understand why he compared her to a caterpillar. Killian then decided to clarify his joke by asking Alexandra if she had ever seen caterpillars that squirm. This is exactly what he thought the girl looked like then, during the dance. Sandy realized that her dancing skills left much to be desired, so she couldn't even object. Besides, seeing her master smile so brightly was a real blessing for the ordinary maid who admired him so much. Sandy couldn't help but smile when she heard his infectious laugh. This happened on the day when Sandy's work in Chambéry was exactly 1 month old. Seeing how hard she cleaned, one of the maids suggested that she liked it. Then Sandy, with a sad smile, replied that Megan was right, because there is nothing in the world that goes as she would like, and here the result is directly dependent on the efforts made. Taking a broom and a rag in her hands, the girl felt as if she was becoming the mistress of all the dust in the world. When Megan heard this phrase, she thought it was funny. She bowed her head playfully to Sandy, as if greeting royalty. The girl was embarrassed, but played along with her new friend. Thus, playing the roles of the mistress of dust and her assistant, the girls continued cleaning. Suddenly, an unexpected sound came from behind them, causing the maids to startle. Turning around, they saw that all this time the young master had been in the room with them. He smiled involuntarily, having witnessed such a funny moment. Killian approached the maids, causing Sandy some embarrassment, since this was their first meeting. Killian, not missing the opportunity to joke, approached the maids and turned to Sandy with a smile, calling her Your Highness. He wished her to win the fight against dust. That day the girl was ashamed to death, but at the same time she was happy because she was able to see the gentleman's bright smile. For Sandy, that situation was somewhat similar to this one, because despite all the hardships, at the moment she was happy. Noticing how Alexandra blushed, the Lord asked if she felt bad. Then, in response, the girl embarrassedly lowered her gaze and replied that she was fine. But Killian did not believe her, saying that he would not believe her until the girl raised her head. However, Sandy was too embarrassed to look the master directly in the eyes, so she turned away. But seeing her reaction, he gently placed his hands on her cheeks to lift her head and look into her eyes. Looking up and meeting Killian's gaze, Sandy tried not to smile so as not to seem too naive or awkward. His smile was so beautiful that the girl could not take her eyes off it. She could not tear herself away from his eyes, which seemed to drag her into the abyss. With every moment, her admiration for his beauty and charm grew, and her thoughts became confused, so she decided to close her eyes so as not to drown in the pool of their feelings. But after a moment, surprised by Killian's question about memory loss, Sandy suddenly opened her eyes. She was confused and didn't know how to respond. Sandy sheepishly admitted that her memory was a bit fuzzy, and she couldn't remember some details from the past. Killian then decided to clarify whether dancing was one of the few details she couldn't remember. Hearing this question, Sandy remembered her unsuccessful dance in the ballroom and answered with some confusion that there were some moments that were difficult for her to remember, but the doctor assured that everything would stabilize over time. And then, in order not to give herself away, Sandy, imitating Alexandra's manner, said in an arrogant tone that Killian's tactless questions and behavior irritated her. Seeing the old Alexandra in front of him, Killian pulled away from her again. He noted with a grin that Alexandra had always been a little strange since their first meeting, so now the difference in her behavior was not particularly noticeable. Hearing this, the girl was a little embarrassed and did not know how to react to this. But having gathered her thoughts, she turned to the Lord with a question. The girl, with some confusion in her voice, asked Killian for his opinion on whether being weird was something negative or bad. After some thought, he replied that being strange and funny was much better than being ordinary and boring. And he added with a grin that this is why he still hasn't broken off his engagement with her. Hearing his words, the girl decided that this was another strange joke of the gentleman. But at that moment, Killian was quite serious. After some time, the carriage stopped and they got out. Having escorted her to the estate, the Lord said goodbye to her. But before he could return to the carriage, the girl suddenly called him. Walking closer, she handed him a small amount of money. Seeing that it was 6 crowns, Killian immediately realized that this was a round-trip fare. Noticing that the guy was confused, Sandy began to worry, thinking that she had miscalculated something. But the Lord reassured her, saying that everything was true. Hearing these words, the girl calmed down and thanked her for a well-spent day. In response to this, Killian smiled again and said goodbye, while not missing the opportunity to once again mention the beautiful dance they performed together at the ball. The girl was again captivated by his smile. At the same time, she felt some disappointment, realizing that the gentleman was not only smiling at her. On the other hand, she began to admire him even more, realizing that such a noble man smiled even at ordinary people and servants. Back in her room, Sandy stood on the terrace, enjoying the view of the night sky and remembering everything that had happened during the day. For her, this night was like a dream, and she assumed that it was a gift from heaven for the poor, untimely departed maid. Now that Sandy saw her father, albeit from afar and temporarily turned into Killian's bride, she was mentally ready to return the body to her mistress. Therefore, she prayed for Alexandra's speedy return so that she could return her body to her. Half a month has passed since then. Another morning has arrived. Sandy woke up again in Alexandra's body and was confused, not understanding where the real Alexandra had gone, because from that day she never returned. By then, she had begun to get used to her new body and lifestyle. Sandy assumed that perhaps the lady was not going to return, and at some point the maids stopped coming to wake her up in the morning. And during this time, Sandy managed to collect her collection of cleanliness. Every morning she enjoyed tidying up her room herself. She washed the windows and carefully wiped the dust in the room. Having finished the work and seeing the results of her labors, the girl felt deep satisfaction. In such an ambiguous situation, when she was neither a dead maid nor a living mistress, Sandy felt alive only while cleaning. She was alone with her experiences and problems, and every day when she woke up, she had to set herself up in a positive way. On the same day at the Duke's estate, everything developed according to the usual scenario. The assistant was amazed to notice that the young gentleman was sitting calmly and absorbed in reading a book, while he should have been preparing for a meeting with Miss Clement. Killian answered with humor, as always, never missing an opportunity to joke. Then Helly inquired about the Lord's relationship with the cute ballerina, to which he replied that their relationship was not that serious. Having finished the conversation, Killian and his assistant headed to the Clement estate. Helly was surprised that the Lord agreed so quickly and immediately got ready to set off. Killian explained this by saying that Alexandra used to be both annoying and funny, but after that incident, her aggression decreased. Therefore, the Lord noticed that with her he became much more comfortable and more fun. At the same time, the Count and his wife were also extremely surprised that Alexandra did not make a scene and did not demand that the engagement be broken. They didn't know what was causing the changes in her, but they hoped that everything would remain that way, because lately the girl had behaved quietly and calmly. Moreover, such an Alexandra, in their opinion, could become a good wife for Killian. The Count was also extremely pleased that the Lord had recently begun to treat his bride better. But the Count, being an old-school politician, considered Killian too soft in his approaches and decisions. While he was willing to force people to work for a pittance, the Lord introduced his affairs more honestly and fairly. Based on the fact that in political and business matters Killian even opposes his grandfather as a couple, the Countess was not sure that after the wedding the guy would defend the interests of their family. However, the Count was sure that over time Killian would come to his senses, but now, due to his age, he simply does not understand what the realities of this world are. He considered the Lord a young fool who wanted to change the world. But at the same time, Killian was the heir to the most respected and powerful house in the kingdom, which is why the Count couple so wanted to marry Alexandra to him. Noticing that Alexandra came out without an umbrella, the maid hurried to bring her an umbrella. Like a true lady, Sandy took an umbrella. But in her heart she was unhappy, because she wanted to enjoy the rays of the autumn sun a little more. The maid continued to anxiously look after her mistress. Sandy was not comfortable with such care, but she also could not object while she was in the role of Alexandra. She was already hot, but Sandy had to endure this torment in silence so as not to seem strange again. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of carriage wheels and the neighing of horses. The long-awaited guest arrived at the estate of Count Clement. Sandy was really glad to see him again. After all, in her opinion, during this time Killian became even more handsome than usual. Sandy looked at her master with admiration reflected in her shining eyes. Killian felt the color rising in his cheeks and tried to remain calm in the face of his fiancé's gaze. As usual, the young couple spent time in a cozy atmosphere, enjoying tea. But this time something changed, and the atmosphere between them was different. Alexandra looked more relaxed and calm, which gave her eyes a special brightness and expressiveness. Previously, Killian was ready to sell his soul so that his bride would keep her mouth shut. But now, the girl calmly drank her tea. Sandy watched her master carefully, and every time she saw him smile, joy filled her heart. The girl, with a smile on her face, could not hide her emotions, and the Lord, noticing this, inquired about the reason for her joy. Sandy was excited by the words she heard and instantly decided to take on the role of an annoyed Alexandra, denying everything that was said. She was very tense, trying to act like a noble lady. Killian took great pleasure in making fun of the new version of his bride. Hearing the words that she had finally learned to sit correctly, the girl shuddered with irritation, because this was a common skill that everyone learns. But Killian didn't stop there. He began to sarcastically applaud, congratulating her on this achievement. After this, the Lord wished that she would learn to walk correctly before she turned 30, which greatly embarrassed Sandy, because she was sure that she walked quickly and efficiently. Pleased with her reaction, the guy smiled and continued drinking tea. Suddenly, Sandy fell silent. Her gaze fell on the cup of aromatic tea on the table. Looking at her reflection, the girl mentally repeated again and again that it was not Sandy who was here and now, but Alexandra. She noticed that she was not acting like Alexandra and realized that her emotions were now betraying her, so she quickly took a sip of tea, trying to calm down. Sandy was very tense, trying to act like a noble lady. Counting every sip she took, she recalled how she once drank a whole cup in one gulp because the tea was so delicious. This was the first time she drank such a delicious drink. But the maids, seeing this behavior of their mistress, were dumbfounded. Because of this, she could not ask for another cup, as she realized that this was not typical for the real Alexandra. Then she decided to try the livers, which also turned out to be very tasty. That's why she didn't notice how she ate the whole plate, which again shocked the maids who were serving her then. Realizing that she was a poor imitator of Alexandra, Sandy decided to do the only thing she was good at. She fainted again. Therefore, she made a firm decision not to make such mistakes today. Sandy struggled to resist the temptation of the cookies that were on the table and attracted her more and more. At this time, Killian was looking out the window, enthusiastically watching the play of light and shadows on the street. Noticing this, Sandy decided to quickly eat one cookie while he wasn't looking. But as soon as she extended her hand to the plate, the Lord immediately turned to her. The girl clutched the cookie in her hand, feeling a surge of excitement. At that moment, thoughts were spinning in her head. She was trying to come up with at least some excuse for Killian. Noticing Alexandra's confusion, the Lord decided to help her and told her that she could eat the cookies. Gratefully accepting his offer, Sandy smiled and began to enjoy the cookies, feeling a little embarrassed but pleasantly relieved. However, she was extremely uncomfortable eating under the gaze of her master. To lighten the atmosphere a little, she invited the Lord to try the cookies too. But then she noticed that the tray was too far from him. Then Sandy, out of habit, acted like a maid. She silently approached and placed the tray right in front of the owner. Killian noticed this immediately, and without missing an opportunity, he ironically praised her for the fact that she had now turned from a madwoman into a maid, emphasizing that this was even useful. Sandy was outraged by these words, but she didn't even have anything to answer. Realizing that she had failed at being Alexandra, Sandy quickly moved to the window to avoid Killian's gaze. But the guy followed her. Standing at the window, the girl was ready to fall through the ground and did not understand why the guy was coming so close. Suddenly, she heard the crunch of a cookie and it caught her attention. The Lord standing nearby was calmly enjoying the cookies, looking out the window and not paying much attention to her. Looking at him, the girl involuntarily began to admire him again, not understanding how a person could be so beautiful even when he was eating. Then she offered him another cookie so that he could admire this beautiful view longer. On the same day, in Sandy's hometown, the sun was shining brightly. The neighbors were surprised to see Matthew because he had not left the house for a long time. Everyone was wondering why he came out and where he was going. I was especially curious to know what was in the cart. It was a marble statue of his wife and daughter that Matthew placed next to their graves. He looked at the statue with love and awe, embodying the images of his beloved wife and beautiful daughter. He could not contain his emotions and tears welled up in his eyes. On his knees, he hugged the statue, feeling great sadness and regret for not being able to protect his family. He prayed, asking for forgiveness for his failure to protect them. After much deliberation, after asking his wife and daughter, Matthew decided to leave the city behind. He could no longer live in a house filled with memories of Sandy and her mother. He decided to move to another city to start a new life and leave the past behind. That night, Sandy had a dream about her father. In that dream, Matthew was leaving her behind. She called him, but he did not hear. Unable to catch up with her father, she woke up from her sleep, her eyes filled with tears. She sat on the bed, trying to calm down and realize that it was all just a dream. However, her emotions continued to overwhelm her, and she decided to visit her father to calm down. That same day, she headed to her hometown. The girl decided that since she could not leave Alexandra's body yet, it would be better to tell her father about everything. But at the same time, she was worried that if the real Alexandra returned and took her body, then Matthew would not be able to withstand such a blow a second time. However, she was sure of one thing. She wanted to see him. And now, after just 3 hours, the girl was already standing in front of her home. But to her surprise, there was a lock on the door. This caused her great surprise, because she remembered all those moments when her father left, leaving the door open. Matthew always took her words about the need to close doors with some levity, and joked that there was nothing valuable in their house except the most beautiful daughter. Realizing that something was wrong here, she ran to check the stables. With great surprise, Sandy discovered that there was neither mule nor the cart there. The girl's heart was filled with anxiety and panic, and she immediately rushed to the neighbors, hoping to get information about her father's whereabouts. She turned to the neighbors, wanting to know what happened and where Matthew had disappeared. Then one of the residents of the town told her that Matthew Willie left the quarry for unknown reasons, but at the same time, the man suggested that he had gone crazy after the death of his only daughter. Having finished the story, the man asked who the stranger was because she looked like a girl from a noble family. However, Sandy was confused and left without answering the question. She couldn't understand where her father could have gone. Sandy, filled with grief and anxiety, did not even notice how she found herself at the graves of her and her mother. She was stunned to see the statue that Matthew had installed. The shock took her breath away, and she fell to her knees in front of the statue, which depicted the happy faces of little Sandy and her mother. Looking at her, she felt all the bitterness and melancholy that her father put into this work. At this time, a regular meeting was held in the castle, at which important issues were discussed and decisions were made. Kilman, showing courage and determination, confidently spoke to those gathered at the meeting, proposing new bills and reforms that could contribute to the development of the kingdom. At the same time, the old aristocracy rejected innovations and considered the Lord's ideas unrealizable. However, Kilman did not shy away from criticism and continued to defend his ideas with confidence and argument, and he believed that only through change and progress could prosperity and justice be achieved for all sections of society. After the meeting, one of his ardent political opponents expressed his dissatisfaction with the behavior of the young aristocrat, saying that he did not understand why the Duke allowed him to behave this way. At the same time, the Lord was educated enough to show his respect to the older generation even under such circumstances, despite political differences. The aristocrat, unable to offend Killian with his words, said goodbye unhappily and left. Only after he left, Helly was able to breathe a sigh of relief, because every time his master argues with higher and respected officials, the poor assistant's heart is ready to explode at any moment. But Killian believed that non-argumentative politicians were politicians who neglected their duty, and at the same time, he believed that they should argue in a graceful and elegant manner. Having finished his work, the Lord headed back to the estate. He, suddenly looking out the carriage window, noticed someone in the distance. It was Alexandra, who was looking enthusiastically into the distance, immersed in her thoughts and not paying attention to her surroundings. Seeing his bride, he immediately stopped the carriage and left him, ordering Helly to return to the estate without him. Noticing someone's presence nearby, the girl was frightened by surprise and shuddered. When the eyes of the young people met, they froze, as if they were in a world where there were only the two of them. Sandy was pleasantly surprised to see the young master. Suddenly, a loud rumbling sound came from the depths of the stomach, reminiscent of an unsatisfied appetite. The Lord was extremely surprised. This was the first time he had encountered something like this. The girl was extremely embarrassed. She wanted to fall through the ground. She turned red as a tomato and tried to hide the sound, but her stomach continued to growl treacherously. Sandy mentally prayed for it to stop. Seeing this funny scene, Killian couldn't hold it in any longer and started laughing loudly. Extremely embarrassed, the girl decided to flee. But the Lord could not allow this, so he hastened to stop the hungry miss. Killian was wondering what Alexandra was doing in such a place, and even alone, so he suggested we talk about it over dinner. To satisfy Killian's curiosity and Alexandra's hunger, they went to a restaurant. Realizing that she had made a serious mistake, Sandy immediately accepted responsibility and apologized for her inappropriate behavior, which did not live up to her image of an ideal lady. But considering all the strange things the girl had already done, Killian thought it was quite charming. The Lord carefully cut the steak and vegetables and handed the plate to Alexandra to begin eating. This was the kind of young master Sandy had always admired. The day was quite tense and eventful, which caused the girl to have tears in her eyes, but she tried to hold on with all her might. Sandy decided to eat first to regain her strength, and then go in search of her father. Killian watched with a smile as Alexandra ate with appetite and pleasure. Noticing that the girl's mood had improved, Killian asked why she was alone in the city. The girl replied that she simply decided to take a walk. But given the distance between the Clement estate and the assembly hall, these words sounded extremely unconvincing. Hearing the guy's question about whether she had been on the train again, Sandy shuddered. Assuming that Alexandra was having secret meetings with another man, Killian, with a stern tone, asked her to sort everything out before the wedding, promising to do the same. But Sandy, being inexperienced in relationships, did not understand what it was about. Then Killian clarified that he did not intend to interfere in her love affairs, but after the wedding, everything would change. When the girl finally realized the essence of what had been said, she jumped up from her seat in confusion, expressing her indignation and surprise. But she immediately became quiet, realizing that she was attracting unnecessary attention. Sitting back in her chair, she expressed her indignation in a quiet voice, explaining that although she had indeed been on the train, she was not one of those immoral ladies who had affairs behind her fiancé's back. Then Killian asked with a grin why, in that case, she refused to say where she was going on the train. But it was very difficult for Sandy to answer this question without revealing her secret. Noticing her tension, Killian promised not to ask the question again and invited her to continue eating. Sandy sighed with relief and agreed to continue dinner. The Lord watched her every move with interest. Looking at the submissive Alexandra, he involuntarily smiled. At that moment, Killian couldn't help but notice that the girl looked very attractive and cute. He never expected that he could have such feelings for his arrogant fiancée. After dinner, the young couple headed home. Since Killian had previously dismissed his assistant, they had to use a public carriage, and the Lord apologized to Alexandra for the inconvenience. But for Sandy, the carriage was very comfortable. Suddenly the girl asked Killian how to find the person. In order not to arouse unnecessary suspicion, she explained that the father of one of her maids had disappeared, and she, as her mistress, wanted to help find him. The question about the man's name took Sandy by surprise, because she could not tell Matthew Willie's real name, so she said that she did not know his name. Then Killian advised her to contact the police, but the girl clarified that the man most likely did not disappear, but left himself. Hearing this, Killian assumed that he had abandoned his family, which angered Sandy, because she could not allow her beloved father to be spoken ill of. Realizing the inappropriateness of her violent reaction, the girl with a calm voice tried to explain that, according to her maid, that person was not the type who was capable of such a thing. After listening to Alexandra, Killian noted with a smile that she had never been so annoying. All Sandy could answer to this was to apologize. Still, Killian recommended that she go to the police, even if it wasn't a disappearance. He also offered his help, saying that he was ready to go to the police in her place if she found out the man's name. Sandy was glad to receive support from her master, but still she couldn't say the name, so she simply thanked the Lord with a smile. When they arrived at the Clement estate, it was already night. The Count was furious because Alexandra left without telling anyone and returned late at night. Like a true gentleman, Killian accepted all the blame and apologized. In addition, he acquitted Alexandra in front of her brother, saying that they spent the entire day together. Hearing this, the Count calmed down and only warned that this would not happen again. In response, Killian apologized again and promised that this would not happen again. Having received the Count's permission, the maids immediately came up to escort Alexandra to their chambers. The girl did not even have time to properly say goodbye to the Lord and only quietly thanked him. But even so, Killian watched his sweet bride with admiration. The next day, the Count and Countess were extremely surprised to hear that Alexandra wanted books. She asked for several books to read. Hearing these words, the Count's couple began to laugh loudly, taking it as a joke. But realizing that she was serious, the Count angrily told her to stop talking nonsense and do what she usually does, that is, play princess. And after she left, the couple continued to make fun of Alexandra. At that moment, Sandy realized how difficult it was for the real Alexandra to live with such people. She understood when the neighbors laughed at her because of her love of reading, since she was the daughter of a quarry worker. But she could not understand why the family mocked Alexandra because she was a noblewoman. Looking at her reflection in the mirror, Sandy turned to Alexandra. Living for so long in the body of her mistress, she noticed that the Count Clement family was very strange. There was no one in this house who loved Alexandra. They either ignored her or openly despised her. To calm down a little and take a break, Sandy decided to start cleaning. After cleaning, she felt refreshed and got to work. In total, she had several goals: to find her father, increase her stamina, and repay the debt of 8 crowns to the young Master Killian for the public carriage. She was also wondering if she should pay him back for dinner. After Sandy's death, none of the maids could keep Killian's room perfectly clean. The Lord felt uncomfortable living in such a room, but at the same time he understood that his requirements for cleanliness were too high, so he did not punish the maids. At such moments, Killian realized that of all the maids, only Sandy Willie was the best. Since the Lord had nothing better to do, he decided to go talk to his grandfather. Passing by the portrait of his father, he stopped for a while. Edwin Winfried died suddenly at the age of 34. A little further there was a small, inconspicuous door. Looking at her, Killian remembered her adventure which began with this secret door. Running up to his father, little Killian excitedly told him that there was a strange world behind the door. The father, after carefully listening to his son's story, explained with a gentle voice that this is not a strange world. Behind the door are the people who created their Chamberleys. His father gently touched Killian's head and with kindness in his voice asked him not to forget about it. That day, Edwin told his son that luck made him who he is, and there are people out there who allow him to live like that. For Killian, this small door became a barrier between him and the rest of the world. Killian's parents often reminded him of the importance of maintaining a sense of compassion for other people and said that this quality would help him become a great politician and make the right decisions for the good of society. And on the day they were killed, these were the words they said goodbye to their child. Killian, left alone, decided that he must continue their work and become a politician who will strive for justice and peace in the world. He looked down on rich bastards who profit from poor people. Thus, Killian decided to follow his parents' example and follow in their footsteps. Lost in thought, Killian finally found himself in front of his grandfather's office door, but he could not meet with the Duke because he had guests. The way things turned out, Killian decided to spend the evening with his slightly cute fiancée. At this time, Sandy was busy trying on new outfits. Hearing that Alexandra wanted to ask something, the tailor shuddered, thinking that it would not be possible to return home early, but still agreed to answer. Geoffrey Crock was the best tailor in Libertonia, and he had only 2 customers who put him through all kinds of suffering. The first is the charming girl, Alexandra Clement, who always baffles him with her impossible requests. And the second is her fiancé, who was very attentive to even the smallest details. Geoffrey was already nervous, not imagining what an incredible request would be this time. But her request turned out to be quite normal. She just asked to sew one simple dress and a practical dress for her. The tailor was dumbfounded by this request. Sandy happily began to describe what her dress should be like, and added that she also wanted to ask for an apron and a cap. Hearing these words from the lips of the arrogant and narcissistic lady, the tailor and maids were speechless from shock. Noticing their confusion, Sandy quickly corrected her mistake, explaining that she needed not just an apron, but a special apron befitting a princess. Exhausted Geoffrey, forcing out a working smile, promised to do everything as Alexandra asked. Having finished discussing the dresses, the tailor said goodbye and left, after which one of the maids told Alexandra that a letter had arrived from Killian. The letter said that today the weather is good, sunny, and therefore the Lord invites his bride to take a walk together. Having received an invitation from her beloved gentleman, Sandy was beside herself with happiness. Sandy, full of enthusiasm and joy, accepted Killian's invitation. Arriving 10 minutes ahead of schedule, Killian was shocked to see Alexandra already there. Noticing Killian, Sandy happily rose from the bench and walked towards him. Beaming with joy, Sandy smiled in greeting and explained her early arrival by saying that the weather was so beautiful that she wanted to enjoy the sun's rays and recharge with positive energy. At that moment, the young man's heart skipped a beat. Killian's heart had never beat so much because of Alexandra's beauty, and her clear and sparkling eyes made her look like another person. Having gathered his thoughts, the Lord extended his hand to her and invited her to go together. They walked along the well-groomed alleys of the park, enjoying the soft sunlight and autumn landscapes. Sandy tried to hold the umbrella so as to cover Killian from the bright sun rays. Noticing this, the Lord said that she should keep the umbrella for herself. Hearing this, Sandy realized that her maid habits were showing again, and, switching to the haughty Alexandra mode, she tried to explain herself, saying that it happened by accident. She was simply tired because she could not hold the umbrella, which is why it began to tilt. Then Killian jokingly noted that since she was so weak, she would soon have to lie in a coffin. After these words, the girl decided that it would be better to remove the umbrella altogether. Sandy's heart trembled with admiration for the young master, and she found him charming, but sometimes his words touched her to the quick. Feeling the pleasant rays of the sun on her face, the girl stopped sulking. Beaming with happiness, Sandy enjoyed the moment, feeling the warmth penetrate her soul. Suddenly she felt that Killian was looking at her with undisguised interest. Then the girl became worried, thinking that she had done something wrong again. But the guy calmed him down, saying that this was not so. After that, lowering his eyes in embarrassment, The Lord noticed that Alexandra looked especially beautiful today. Sandy's heart sank with joyful excitement and happiness after these words. The blushing girl, imitating Alexandra's manner, indignantly asked why he was saying this. But the guy just smiled and didn't answer. Then the girl reminded him of his recent ridicule, when he said that she needed to lie in a coffin. But Killian did not make excuses, but clarified that that was then, and this is happening now. In addition, the Lord found Alexandra's reaction to his words about her beauty amusing. However, Sandy believed that there were no girls who would not like compliments of this kind. Then Killian confidently answered that Alexandra was one of these girls. He reminded her that she always hated being flattered, but the girl clarified that this concerned other people. Then, leaning against her, Killian asked if these words meant that he was different, to which Sandy hesitantly replied that yes, since he was her fiancé. But she suddenly fell silent, remembering that the real Alexandra hated her fiancé. Then, to avoid further questions, Sandy resorted to her favorite method of solving all problems: fainting. In response to the Lord's words that she had not staged such performances for a long time, the girl with an offended voice replied that this was not a game at all, and she was dizzy, which is why she could not stand on her feet. Although Killian was sure that Alexandra was faking, he, like a true gentleman, helped her sit down on the bench. In any case, contrary to her true feelings, Sandy reminded the Lord that she did not like him, since she was aware that she was still in Alexandra's body. But Killian found it difficult to believe these words before. He himself was sure of this. But now he felt that everything was different. Confused, Sandy, still in the role of Alexandra, hastened to refute these arguments, repeating once again that she did not like Killian. But the more vehemently she denied, the less convincing she sounded. And Killian's words, that there is nothing surprising in the fact that a girl can like the person she marries, completely shocked her. She completely forgot about this important detail. Besides, the Lord continued his speech. Regardless of whether they liked each other or not, they would still have to get married, in which case he believed that it would be much better if they liked each other. Only after these words did Sana remember that Alexandra and Killian were expecting to get married next summer. She was very worried that if the lady never returned, then Sandy Willie would marry instead of Alexandra Clement. Sandy did not want to continue to fool her master, but she could not tell such an absurd truth. However, mentally, the girl had already admitted to him many times that she was not Alexandra. Watching the change in expressions on his fiancé's face, Killian smiled slightly. Sandy wanted to tell Killian a lot, but she couldn't say a word. After a short rest on the bench, the young couple continued their walk in silence. Looking at Alexandra's sad face, Killian wondered why she was offended, and suggested that perhaps it was because of his words that sometimes you can love the person you marry. Suddenly, the girl broke the silence, saying that she forgot to give Killian something. After these words, she handed him the money. Sandy explained to the Lord that this was payment for the public carriage that day. Killian jumped in surprise when he heard that Alexandra was returning his money for the trip. But the girl did not stop there, and said that she would return the money for dinner later. Seeing that Killian didn't understand what she was talking about, Sandy reminded him of the day he paid for dinner. Not knowing how to react in such a situation, Killian answered in confusion that this was commendable for her. Sandy took these words too literally and asked how much the dinner cost so she could pay for it. However, the Lord did not name the amount, saying that he did not need the money. In return, he offered Alexandra to treat him to dinner today in exchange. Seeing the girl's worried behavior, Killian thought that she did not want to have dinner with him a second time. But that wasn't the case at all. Sandy was just not ready for such a turn of events, so she took only 100 crowns with her and didn't know if it would be enough for dinner. Killian, noticing Sandy's worries, deliberately hesitated to answer, while the girl nervously waited for which restaurant he would choose. And yet the Lord did not torture his bride for long, and said that he left the choice to her. Then the girl led Killian to the place where she often ate. As Sandy, however, after they arrived, she realized that this establishment was not entirely suitable for aristocrats. Therefore, she hastened to justify herself and said that she learned about this restaurant from the maid, with whom she had a close relationship. The innkeeper immediately recognized Killian and approached them. He was incredibly happy that such an important person visited his establishment. After Kevin Parker introduced himself, Killian also introduced his fiancée, Alexandra. Kevin was certainly glad that the young couple visited his tavern, but realizing that his establishment did not meet the standards of aristocrats, he still decided to ask why they chose his restaurant. Then Alexandra replied with a charming smile that they had just come to eat. Taking the menu, Sandy began to order. Realizing that it seemed strange that she was so familiar with local dishes, Sandy said that these dishes were recommended to her by the maid. Once again, hearing about the maid with whom Alexandra is close, Killian asked who she was, since she was able to get close to such an incredible mistress. Sandy was glad to hear compliments addressed to her from the young master. At the same time, Killian was surprised that Alexandra did not notice the irony and took his words about her unusualness as a compliment. After some time, all the ordered dishes were served to the table. After that, Killian was the first to start eating. Sandy was glad to see that Killian liked everything, as she was worried that the local food might not be to the aristocrat's liking. Noticing her gaze, the Lord asked her why she looked that way. Being in high spirits, Sandy herself did not notice how she blurted out that Killian looked especially beautiful today. In response, the guy just smiled. Sandy was disheartened that the young master was not even surprised by this answer, to which Killian replied that it would be foolish to be surprised by the truth. Having said these words, he again showed her his charming smile. Sandy's heart fluttered when she saw the expression on his face, and she couldn't take her eyes off him. But after a few seconds, she came to her senses and got scared, realizing what a mistake she had made. On behalf of Alexandra, the girl again repeated that this does not mean that she likes the Lord. Killian didn't even know how to react to these words. The way Alexandra always tried to deny her sympathy for him looked cute and funny. Therefore, even when they finished dinner and were already leaving the tavern, Killian still could not stop laughing. Leaving the establishment, the girl noticed a shop with sweets. Seeing her interested look, Killian asked her to choose one. But the girl hastened to refuse as she was embarrassed to accept her master's offer. However, Killian did not give up so easily. He said that this was his gratitude for the good dinner. Hearing these words, Sandy did not object anymore and chose chocolate caramel. The saleswoman, who had not been able to sell a single piece of candy for a long time, was very happy to see buyers. But when she heard the price, Sandy became angry. Since 12 crowns was too expensive for one candy, especially earlier, when she was still a maid, she sometimes bought these candies and knew their real cost. However, the merchant, realizing that the aristocrats were standing in front of her, for whom 12 crowns was a trifle, insisted on her own. After some bargaining, the woman agreed to sell for 8 crowns, but Sandy knew that the caramels were worth much less. Their argument was interrupted when Killian, having paid 10 crowns, left, calling Alexandra with him. The girl followed him, continuing to insist that he had paid too much and needed to come back for change. To the Lord's question about how the Count's daughter knew the cost of street sweets so well, Sandy replied that the maid told her. Suddenly, Killian stopped and, turning sharply to the girl, sternly called her by name. He explained to her that even if the cost was too high, a few crowns was not a big loss for him. But Sandy did not understand Killian, since she still reasoned like a commoner, for whom every penny was worth its weight in gold. Because she felt deceived, at the same time the Lord thought completely differently. He believed that they were lucky to be born aristocrats, and their wealth could not be compared with some 6 crowns. After these words, Sandy understood Killian's point. She felt ashamed that she had behaved this way earlier. She was so embarrassed that she couldn't even look Killian in the eye, so she walked ahead of him. At that moment, Sandy realized how different the life of a nobleman was from the life of a maid. Upon returning to the estate, Killian had a serious conversation with the Duke. Having learned about the young couple's walk together, the Duke decided to ask his grandson if this meant that she began to like Alexandra, because he always felt guilty for single-handedly making the decision about their engagement. Although Killian considered this only a marriage of convenience, the Duke sincerely hoped that his grandson would be happy in this marriage. In order to console his grandfather's anxious heart, Killian nevertheless admitted that lately he had become more kind to his bride. Killian's grandfather, having heard this confession, calmed down a little, as he saw that his grandson was beginning to change his attitude towards marriage for the better, and this gave him hope for a happy future for the young couple. He was very happy to learn that Alexandra was changing for the better and even offered to organize a banquet in honor of her complete recovery. Killian also supported this idea. Having finished his conversation with the Duke, the Lord returned to his chambers. While getting dressed, Killian discovered some candy in his pocket, which reminded him of his day. Looking at them, he remembered Alexandra's words that the caramels were very good and should be shared. I remembered how, in parting, the girl thanked him for a good time and promised to buy him a return gift next time. Her bright smile was still in front of his eyes as she said those words. Every day, Killian became more and more imbued with feelings for Alexandra, and in his eyes she became sweeter and sweeter. A few days later, Alexandra received an invitation from Chamberlain. While the maids busily prepared her to leave, Sandy wondered whether she would be able to get back her box of letters from her father, her diary, and her savings. Before leaving, she asked the maid for a cloak with pockets to realize her idea. And so, having finished all the preparations, Sandy set off.